And just to kind of open this up a little bit, so Kersey is what's kind of interesting because it's a very beautiful village. As I say, a place that is sort of so full of history, it just makes you gasp. It's so perfect. But like a lot of places kind of left behind to a degree with modern progress, it's had quite a few strange happenings there. And so I thought, rather than just give you an orthodox history of Kersey, which I could have done, but I've chosen not to do. It does go to Humphrey as well, Humphrey's treats. You're quite right, Leslie. What I thought we'd do was kind of focus in on some interesting stories, so a bit of supernatural, a bit of paranormal, story of a murder, and a time slip. Yeah. So for you to work out, is there something a little bit specially interesting about this particular little hamlet? So I hope that does us good. So good evening, everybody. Welcome to this at-home presentation. We're about to roll VT and we're about to go and visit Kersey, a beautiful medieval village, perhaps one of the most beautiful villages anywhere in England. Like a lot of my videos, we're going to start on the outskirts and kind of walk our way in. And I'm going to do so. I'm going to tell you about a rather mysterious story that happened to two young girls. And the name of those two young girls is Dot and Josie. And this is a story from Hereabouts, told many years after us. By a lady who was only in the autumn of her years. But the strange story she told here had happened when she was a child. So Dot and Josie were typical 8-year-old chatterboxers. On that Saturday afternoon in October 1935, they were in high spirits. They'd been on a walk with Dot's mother and were looking forward to tea at her grandmother's, especially her yummy, fabulous cakes. They'd walked back from the town, but were now in an open country and taking a path across the fields. Ahead, the old church loomed above the outline of the village, surrounded by a dark gloom. "Come along, you two," chived Dot's mum as they neared the church. Just then something caught Josie's eye in the field across the road. "What are those funny-looking people doing?" she asked. Dot and her mother looked at where she'd pointed. In the field were a man and a woman dressed in strangely summery clothes. The woman in a long dress and the man in loose, light-coloured shirt and trousers. "They look like they're in fancy dress," giggled Dot. Josie dug her in the ribs. "There's something wrong with them." Sorry, my page here has just got stopped. "There's something wrong with them," is what she said. The two people coming towards them, but moving slowly and erratically. The man was leaning heavily on the woman, who was struggling under his weight. "Shouldn't we go and help?" asked Josie. At that, Dot's mum gasped and grabbed their coat sleeves to stop them dashing across the road. They watched the couple reach the road and make their painful way across. Sorry, I'll start this again. Dot and Josie shivered as a strong cold wind seemed to come to them out of nowhere. They could now see that the woman was wearing an old-fashioned nurse's uniform and the man looked like he was in a nightshirt. As the couple stepped on the road, a car suddenly appeared. Josie cried out and felt Dot's mum's grip on her arm tighten. The car ground to a halt, and the driver jumped out, swearing and brandishing his starting handle. But neither the couple nor he paid any attention to each other. They kept crossing, and he started cranking his engine, which didn't respond. The strange couple were only a few yards from Dot and Josie now. The girls shivered in the increasing cold. Dot's mum's grip remained very tight as the couple began to scramble up the bank. They were clearly exhausted. The man was dragging his leg. The woman was talking, but the wind seemed to blow the words away. The girls felt rooted to the spot, as if something besides Dot's mum was stopping them moving. The man and the woman reached the top of the slope, where the field bordered some shrubby woodland known as the Glen. And upon reaching the trees, they disappeared from view. The girls immediately felt released, and Dot's mum pulled them sternly along. "Hurry up, we'll be late for tea." They heard the car splutter into life and drive off. Dot and Josie hardly noticed passing the old church. But once they got to the other side, the wind dropped and the sky went bright. So what can we make sense of what they'd seen? Well, it seems that we can by going back in history. In the summer of 1854, Mary Treece left her home village near Bury St Edmunds and went into town to help nurse the wounded soldiers coming home from the Crimea. Her father was none too pleased. "There's plenty of work he's doing on the farm," he said. "Girls should stay home, not get off on their own, and a young unmarried lass like you nursing young men is downright indecent." But off she went anyway. The hospital in a large house on the north side of the town was soon full. Mary had to learn fast. She was no stranger to blood and injuries, thanks to life on the farm. But what she faced now was hard to take. The amputations, the wounds that would not heal, the despair. She became strong, always kept a smile on her face. Sometimes that smile was the only medicine she could give. There was one man for whom her smile became brighter. At first she felt for him. His leg had been fractured by a musket ball at Inkerman, and the patching up in a Turkish military hospital hadn't helped much. Bury St Edmunds wasn't his home, nor even England, as his Irish brogue made plain. He'd been recruited by the 63rd West Suffolks when they'd been stationed at Cork. Mary knew she shouldn't have favourites. Matron was very strict on that, but Connor had no family to visit him, and she loved to hear him speak about his home, and the family farm that sounded so like hers. Ireland sounds so beautiful, she said when he described the lush green fields and hills. Aye, and when I'm well, my darling, I'll take you there, and you can see for yourself. He clasped her hand for a moment as he said it. Mary's heart skipped, and she squeezed back. Back on the farm on her days off, she was determined to speak of her work at the hospital. The patients are so grateful. It's a gift when they recover. Before she knew it, she was telling them about Connor. She felt her cheeks heat as she did, and saw her mother look fearfully at her husband. Farmer Treese banged his fist on the table. Connor, what sort of name is that? It's foreign, that's what he is, and he's spinning you a likely yarn, my girl. Thinks he can lure you away fancy talk, does he? Not while I have breath in me. If he lays a finger on you, I'll be after him with my gun. A few days later, back at the hospital, she had a visit from her brother Rob. Dad's in a rare old temper, he warned. If you don't come home, he'll be over here to get you. Mary was furious with him and Adar, and then to top it all, she was summoned to the matron's office. Nurse Treese, your father has requested your return home. The tale he tells is very disappointing. You know you must not consort with the men. Mary stared at her, the fury mounting. To her surprise, Matron's face softened. You're a good worker. I don't wish to lose you. If I allow you to remain as your father's wishes, your behaviour must be exemplary. You will not be treating Private Flynn again. He'll be transferred tomorrow. Outside the office, Mary's heart was racing. Those few short words from Matron had made everything clear. She could not leave Connor. She loved him. She crept to his ward after dark, put her finger to her lips when he would have greeted her. He immediately sensed something was wrong. What is it, Mary? He asked. How far do you think you can walk now? She whispered. His face fell, but she ploughed on. They're going to send you away, or me. We have to get away from here. I've got a plan, a bit of one anyway. First thing tomorrow, I'm coming to get you, if you can walk. Mary, I'll try. I don't know how far. Suddenly he gripped her hand in his, and she saw in his eyes an echo of her own feelings. I'll not lose you. Before it was light, Mary came into the ward. A whispered word to the night nurse about an errand sent the girls scurrying away. Connor was awake. She eased him out of bed. He could but wait on the leg now, and they made good progress through the building. Mary had left her bag and blanket ready in a hook by the back door. She threw the blanket over his shoulders, and they were out and slipping down the lane to the fields beyond. The leg that had seemed almost mended in the hospital didn't hold up well on a rough, damp October grass, but Connor didn't complain. They'd made a big loop to find their way across the river. They huddled under a tree to eat the bread and cheese from Mary's bag, and Mary could see the hollowness of his eyes, but refused to admit to herself she'd made a mistake. As they walked on, a chill wind got up, gaining in strength even as Connor's strength was fading. How much further, Mary? She took his face in her hands and lifted his tired head. His eyes were not defeated, resigned. She took a deep breath and put on a hospital smile. Look, there's some woods ahead. See on that bit of a hill? If we can reach there, we can rest until morning. There's a road above the wood that goes out of town, and have the money for a stagecoach. Think your Irish hills, Connor. We'll see them yet, you and me. Her words seemed to give him new strength. There was a field, then a road to cross, the wind tugging at them. The blanket blew away, but Mary couldn't rescue it. Connor was leaning heavily on her now. Nearly there, she gasped. In the cover of the trees, Mary eased Connor down against a tree trunk and attended to his leg bandage. She couldn't look at his face, so grey with exhaustion was it. She'd been a fool to think he was fit. The snap of twigs, though, made them both look up. Standing right in front of them was Mary's father, gun in hand, contorted with fury. Thought you could steal my daughter, did you dirty bastard? Mary flung herself at her father's feet. No, father, no, she screeched. You don't understand, we love each other. Her words were killed by the gunshot. She wheeled around and screamed. Connor lay limp against the tree, blood spilling from his chest, his eyes empty. Moments later, there was a sergeant on the scene, and Farmer Treese was taken away. Mary pieced together the story afterwards. The alarm raised at the hospital when they'd realised they'd gone. A sergeant at the regiment was summoned, and a search party was sent out. Then her father had arrived, demanding to take her home. When he'd learned of their disappearance, he seized the shotgun from under the seat of his trap and set out to find them. He found an old man who'd seen them, and then he spotted them climbing the bank to the wood. In those days, there was only one penalty for murder. Mary never returned home. Her father shunned her, blaming her. Her family blamed her for her father's hanging. She blamed herself, could hardly bear to be in her own skin. When the call came from Florence Nightingale for nurses to go to the Crimea, she took a ship straight away. Nursing became her life. When the war was done, she stayed nursing, wouldn't go back to Suffolk. She took herself to the Irish hills Connor had told her about, and that is where she stayed. Still shivering, Dot and Josie hurried after Dot's mum. Those people were odd, Dot ventured at last. Like they didn't even see us, like they weren't quite there. Her mother pursed her lips and said nothing. I'm going to tell Grandma about it. She knows everything, said Dot. Then, behind them from the direction of the glen, came a loud, sharp bang. The girls stopped dead. It sounded for all the world like a gun. Just someone after rabbits, said the mother, but grasping the hands of the girls, pulled them along and away from the direction of the gunshot. Then came a scream, a woman's anguished scream that went on and on. Dot's mother stood and stared, but the girls turned and ran and didn't stop until they reached the grandma's house. So that's the story that Dot told many years later. The events happened originally, as we know, in 1853. They experienced the phenomena in 1935. And that story came out around about 1980, so many years later. So I think it's just a lovely story, but an interesting sign of what happens when places seem to get trapped. Now, on our way into the church, we're about to pass the village school. And I didn't want to sort of film too much of the school, but just to sort of pop in. It's actually the smallest school in Suffolk. And I'm sure very, very similar to the one where Dot and Josie attended in the 1930s. So we're about to come in now into Kersey itself. And I hope you agree, managed to get beautiful light on the day this was filmed. It is so sad to haunt the place, and I think that's something, isn't there, about that trauma, sort of trapped for all time, that even though I'm sure she found some measure of personal happiness in the hills around Cork, something in it died that day, and it kind of haunts the place. So Kersey is first mentioned in, this is the school. It's the smallest school in Suffolk. So Kersey is first mentioned in an Anglo-Saxon will around about 900 AD. So Kersey, so it's spelled Kersey, but we'll come to the spelling in a minute, was already a thriving community at the time of the Norman conquest in 1066. The Domesday Book of 1086 described the village's inhabitants and their farming activities, as well as mentioning the church. We don't actually know where the name Kersey comes from. There's a number of theories around the origin of the name Kersey, not least due in the fact that before standard English spelling was introduced, there was many variations of how a name was written. So it's been written down variously as Kersey, spelled Caersig, or same Kersey with IGE on the end. Around about 995, 999, so the very end of the kind of the Viking sort of period. And it suggests it entered a wet area with cress. And this might be the area on the splash that you're going to see in a minute. Could be the site of kind of Kersey Mill. In Domesday Book, it's called Kerseria, and then Kersey in 1220 in a book of Anglo-Saxon charters. So lots and lots of versions. So typically St Mary's there built of Suffolk. In Suffolk, so you use a lot of flint. So whereas we use magnesium limestone, very, very characteristic of these beautiful square early churches of Suffolk. I'm a huge fan of these Suffolk churches, but made of kind of stone and flint, so the usual kind of building materials. So St Mary stands aloof from the village street at the top of the hill. And the view across you can see at the minute is across the Brett Valley, which is magnificent. So the tower is that of a Suffolk cloth church. And it's like a little sister to the nearby church of Lavenham. Lavenham is rather grander, and of course it reflects the wealth of the village. But nonetheless, it's really a fabulous little church, and surprisingly grand for a small village. And the tower really, if like, overshadows the rest of the church, and partly this is, as I'll relay in a minute, building work stopped, but like at the Minster, in this case, because of the Black Death, the building work stopped, so consequently it's out of balance. It's not a symmetrical church, and the north side is a good deal kind of less grand, so the north aisle and the nave appear kind of rather small. Which, in fact, they're not really for a village church, just because the tower gives a sense of the dominance on one side isn't matched by the other, if that kind of makes sense. The chancel, by the way, you're going to see in a minute, is all Victorian, so it's a kind of mix of Victorian and medieval. But isn't it just beautiful? I love the kind of the patterning as well. Kind of around the bottom there, you can see the sort of squares. Not much, by the way, of coloured glass. So compared to York's medieval churches, a good deal kind of plainer. But flint, as Susan puts out, flint pit not too far away. So again, they use the local building materials. Nobody was really going to be arguing to go and bring stone from a long, long distance. So the north door then faces the village, but the main entrance to the church is through the flushwork of the south porch, one of Suffolk's best. So it's in effect on the main entrance on the wrong side of the church. So why build the fine structure, in other words, the tower and this big entrance on the south side rather than north? Well, perhaps it's because there was already a good north porch when the late medieval donor chose to contribute a grand new one. But there's another theory, and it's that it wasn't intended for the villagers, but for visitors to the shrine of Our Lady of Kersey. We know that there's a papal bull, so it was issued by the Pope in 1464, that takes up the story, and it says, "To all Christ's faithful, Pius II, having learned that the parish church of St Mary Kersey, called de Piet, in the diocese of Norwich, there was a great resort of the faithful on account of infinite miracles, which by merits and intercessions of the same Virgin had been and were being wrought daily by Almighty God at a certain image of her in the said church." And it's granted in perpetuity under this date of March the 6th to all those who've been truly penitent and having confessed, visit the feet of the Annunciation and Nativity of the said Virgin from the first to the second Vespers, and give alms for the enlargement for the restoration of the said church, and indulge of 3 years and 3 quarantines of enjoyed penance, and said grant to be null and void if any similar unexpired indulgence have been granted by the said Pope. So what that basically means is, if you came here and you did your made a prayer to Mary on Annunciation date 25th of March, or at Christmas, and made a contribution, then you get 3 years of purgatory, kind of buying your way through into heaven. So basically, this was a pilgrim church. So it's obviously a well-ordered, well-kept, well-fed church. Because of its location, obviously, the church sees a large number of visitors. But it's not a kind of easy church to read. It's very mixed up, and it looks like some of those you're looking at there, the wooden panels, probably brought from other churches elsewhere. It's a kind of mixture. You've got bits of 14th century, 15th century, Victorian. This wide kind of north aisle definitely dates from the 14th century. There's some splendid decorated spaces. This, by the way, is the rebuilt shrine. So they've managed to raise £15,000 to rebuild the shrine, which replaces the original shrine to St Mary, which was torn out in the 17th century during the era of Puritanism. And the church said it chose International Women's Day to open the shrine to honour the importance of women in the Bible studies. So Bishop Martin Seeley, who was the Bishop of St Edmunds and Ipswich, wore Wellington boots to take water from the ford in the village to use it in the rehallowing. This is some of the, obviously warlike. You can't really pick out what it is. Possibly St Michael, but as you'll know, I'm sure I've talked to you before, Catholic churches would have had paintwork all over, but then under Edward VI, after the Reformation, and they were all just going to paint them all over. So you see scraps and bits and pieces. In fact, when we were at Easby Church, not so long back, by Richmond there, that's an absolute treasure trove for this kind of painting. The shrine was rehallowed in the presence of American Dougie Vince. Aircraftman Dougie Vince. So the bomber on which he'd served as an engineer was attacked by a German bomber as they returned on a raid on Western Germany. The navigation instruments were destroyed and a fire started towards the rear of the aircraft. The navigator had no positional fix and fuel was critically low. The RAF, however, had installed 2 searchlights in the churchyard at St Mary's, Kersey, which illuminated the church tower, giving pilots a known navigational reference point. As a result, the church gained the nickname of Thank God Church. Mr. Vince's bomber fixed their position and landed on an airfield nearby. His tail gunner died in the fire, but leading aircraftman Vince's hand, which had almost been burnt away as he fought the flames, did actually survive, and so he came and he was part of the reconsecration of the Shrine St Mary, which is lovely. And again, just another wonderful, unusual story kind of about this place. So the shrine certainly would have brought in a lot of visitors in the medieval era, and consequently, of course, a lot of income into the village, because people obviously believed that they could get these intercessions, they could get these better outcomes in the next life, and they kind of period through purgatory, which most people would kind of pass through. So when we kind of visit Kersey Church now, obviously, it feels to me that the grand interior more reflects its 19th century Anglican past more than its Catholic past. But nonetheless, I think you can just see enough to kind of get a sense of this medieval important shrine. And I think just walking in the grounds around it, very, very beautiful. So the shrine survived the dissolution with Rome under Henry VIII, but was destroyed around the time of the Civil War. So it wasn't until 2020 that shrine went back in. It looks like a big saucer, but very lovely, and lots of people. Now, Kersey enjoyed prosperity from the 12th century onwards during the heyday of the Suffolk wool trade in the Middle Ages. And it was known for a coarse twill broadcloth that was an important component in the textile trade in medieval England. And if anybody's heard of it, but like Lavenham has its Lavenham blue, Kersey is also known as cloth, but it's a lesser known, it's a coarse woolen cloth. But it's an important component in the textile trade in the medieval England. Its name comes from Kersey yarn, and ultimately, of course, from the village of Kersey, presumably originating here. However, the cloth was made in many places. Andover, we've got records, where in 1262 there was a regulation about how much Spanish wool could be in a Kersey. Now, Kerseys, where they are referenced in historical sources, and Shakespeare as well, tend to talk about stockings. We hear of black Kersey stockings, and there's reference in 1607 to the stockings that his clownish legs did fit were Kerseys to the calf and the other knit. So in 1577, William Harrison wrote in his description of an Englishman who declared of an Englishman that neither was it merrier with England than when he was known abroad by his own clothes and contented himself at home with fine Kersey hosen. In other words, a bit like wearing a onesie, I think, is what it's kind of suggesting there. You might wear your fine clothes when you're out and about, but when you're at home, Kersey is just a thing for getting by the fire, relaxing, getting kind of all warmed up. Funny enough, my sort of neck of the woods in 1475 in the West Riding of Yorkshire, they were also producing Calderdale. They were producing Kersey. So it does seem that whilst this place gives it its name, it's certainly kind of spread out. And we know that English Kerseys were exported widely to Central Europe and other places. And a surviving business letter from the end of the 16th century recommended trading Kerseys for good wine in the Canary Islands. So it really did kind of get about a bit. So Kersey yarns were spun in large gauges, or thicknesses as they're called, from inferior carded wool, so it wasn't the best stuff, and made thick and sturdy cloth. So Kersey was warp backed, a twill weave cloth woven on a 4-treadle loom. Isn't it gorgeous, that gave me? Whilst the impression is given Kersey was inferior, historical sources tend to relate its lesser value more due to its size. So compared to a broadcloth which we made in Lavenham, it is very big and wide. So broadcloth happened to be 2 yards wide and 24 yards long. So a very big piece of fabric. However, a Kersey was only 1 yard wide and 18 yards long. So quite a bit smaller. So it does seem that's the kind of differentiation. So you could fit 3 Kerseys with 48 square yards of cloth, the same size as one broadcloth, which is a third of a broadcloth. They are beautiful. So it's sort of typical of many Suffolk villages of the time. Kersey was also a farming village. But cloth was its main trade for centuries. Um, I just love this, isn't it beautiful, this lich gate? So this is all on the south side. As I was saying, it's not actually leading to the main entrance of the church, which sort of seems sort of slightly incongruous, but it is nonetheless an absolute fabulous porch. And hopefully you've enjoyed your little foray. We're going to pop down into the village just a minute. So the period where this absolutely kind of reaches its epitome, if you like, of wealth and importance is around 1450 to 1530. That's not the church, that's the village as a whole. And that's the high watermark of the Suffolk cloth industry, especially the broadcloth industry, concentrated in the triangle between Clare, Bury St Edmunds, and East Berkholt, of which Kersey is the centre. So, let's go to the village. So, looking at this village as a time capsule connecting us to medieval England is not difficult to imagine that we're in a different era. But three teenage boys in the 1950s claimed they'd actually stepped back in time when they visited the village. The world is full of weird phenomena, but one of the strangest and rarest is the time slip. There are instances when people claim to have been momentarily being transported to a different era or time period. One of the most famous examples of this phenomenon is the Kersey time slip incident, during which three teenage boys from the United Kingdom claimed to have seen the village of Kersey hundreds of years in the past. Whilst nearly impossible to prove, experts have struggled to fully discount the witness version of the events. So what's the truth? Did these boys really travel back in time? Or is there a more reasonable explanation? Looking back, they said, the really strange thing was the silence. The way the church bells stopped ringing as a little group of naval cadets neared the village. The way the ducks even stood quiet and motionless by the shallow stream that ran across the road where the main street began. And when the boys thought about it afterwards, they recalled that even the autumn birdsong faded as they neared the first houses. The wind had dropped to nothing too. Not a leaf stirred on the trees as they passed, and the trees appeared to cast no shadows. The street itself was quite deserted. Not so odd, perhaps, for a Sunday morning in 1957, especially in the rural heart of England. But even the remotest British hamlets displayed some sign of modernity by then. Cars parked by the roadside, phone wires strung along the roads, aerials on roofs. And there was nothing of that sort in this village. They were ragged, hand-built, timber-framed, almost medieval in appearance, one boy thought. The three, all Royal Navy cadets, walked up to the nearest building and pressed their faces to its grimy windows. They could see it was some sort of butcher shop. When they glimpsed in the interior, it was even more unsettling, as one of them recalled later for the author Andrew Mackenzie, who's the source for this story. They said, looking through the window, there was no tables or counters, just two or three whole oxen carcasses, which had been skinned and in places were quite green with age. There was a green painted door and windows with smallish glass panes. One at the front and one at the side. Look at that, the old AA sign on the way. It's Automobile Association, by the way, in case you know. So they're very dirty looking. I remember that as we three looked through that window in disbelief at the green and mouldy green carcasses, the general feeling of certainty was one of disbelief and unreality. Who believed that in 1957 the health authorities would allow such conditions? They peered into another house. It too had greenish, smeary windows, and it too appeared uninhabited. The walls had been crudely whitewashed, but the rooms were empty. The boys could see no possessions, no furniture, and they thought the rooms themselves appeared not to be of modern-day quality. Spooked now, the cadets turned back and hurried out of the strange village. The track climbed a small hill, and they did not turn back until they'd reached the top. Then one of the three of them remembered. Suddenly we could hear the bells once more, and saw the smoke rising from the chimneys. None of the chimneys was smoking when we were in the village. We ran for a few hundred yards, as it were, to shake off the weird feeling. So what happened to those three boys on that October morning more than 60 years ago remains something of a mystery. They were taking part in a map reading exercise that ought to have been straightforward. The idea was to navigate their way across 4 or 5 miles of countryside to a designated point, then to return to base and to report what they'd seen, which, if all went to plan, should have been the picturesque Suffolk village of Kersey. But the more they thought about it, the more the cadets wondered whether something very strange had occurred to them. Years later, William Lang, the Scottish boy who led the group, put it this way: it was a ghost village, so to speak. It was almost as if it walked back in time. I experienced an overwhelming feeling of sadness and depression in Kersey, but also a feeling of unfriendliness and unseen watchers which sent shivers up one's back. I wondered if we'd knocked at a door to ask a question, who might have answered it. It doesn't bear thinking about. So Lang, who came from Perthshire in the Highlands of Scotland, was a stranger to this part of East England, and so were his friends, Michael Crowley from Worcestershire and Ray Baker, a Cockney. That was the point. All three were 15 years old and had only recently just signed up to join the Royal Navy. So that made it really easy for the petty officers in charge of their training to confirm they'd reached the village they were supposed to find just by checking out the descriptions. As it was, their superiors, Lang recalled, were rather sceptical when they told them their odd experience, but they laughed it off and agreed we'd seen Kersey all right. There the matter rested until the late 1980s, when Lang and Crowley, then both living in Australia, talked by phone and chewed over the incident. Lang had always been troubled by it. Crowley emerged did not remember it in as much detail as his old friend, but he did think that something strange had happened, and he recalled the silence, the lack of aerials and streetlights, and the bizarre butcher shop. And that was enough to prompt Lang to write to the author of a book he'd read, Andrew Mackenzie, a leading member of the Society for Physical Research. So Mackenzie was intrigued by Bill Lang's letter and recognised that it might be a case of retrocognition, the SPR term what we would call a time slip case. Looking at the details, he thought it was possible that the three cadets had seen Kersey not as it was in 1957, but as it had been centuries earlier. A long correspondence, because he and Lang exchanged letters for 2 years, and a foray into local libraries with a view, with the help of a historian from Kersey, helped to confirm that view. And in 1990, Lang flew to England from Australia, and the two men walked through the village, reliving the experience. What makes this case particularly interesting is the retrocognition is probably the rarest reported of physical phenomena. There have only ever been a handful of cases, of which by far the most famous remains the Versailles incident of 1901. On that occasion, two highly educated British women, the principal and vice principal of St Hugh's College, Oxford, were wandering through the grounds of the Palace of Versailles outside Paris, where they had a series of experiences that later convinced them that they'd seen the gardens as they were before the French Revolution. Detailed research suggested to them that one of the figures they encountered may have been Marie Antoinette, Louis XVI's wife, and the Queen of France. How strange. Anybody know that story? Is that familiar? Is anybody aware of the Versailles incident? If I just do a quick sip of a drink, and I'll be on to the next one. So another widely publicised case concerned two British couples, the Simpsons and the Gisbys. So this is coming in, by the way, this is the ford that runs through the middle of the village, and depending on the season and how much rain there's been, the ford goes up and down. But basically, every which way you go, you have to drive through the river to get to the other side of the village, which is super, super cool. And very beautiful. This building here, I think, dates from about 1490, the keystone says at the top. So Beautiful colours. I think you'll agree. It really is an absolute treasure. Yeah, 1490 there. So coming towards the centre of the village now, let's work our way back up the hill. So I hope you're enjoying the tour so far, and this strange story. Have we made our mind up yet on time slips? Let me give you another example, and we'll try and pull it apart a bit more and see what we think. So another widely publicised case concerned two British couples, the Simpsons and the Gisbys. And in October 1979, they were driving through France en route to a holiday in Spain. And they came across an extremely old-fashioned looking hotel in Montélimar. The couples decided to stay the night as the other hotels in the vicinity were full. They found the surroundings basic but comfortable, and the locals were dressed in clothing more similar to fashion at the turn of the century. Now, costing only 19 francs for the entire stay, the couples thought there'd been an error and quickly left. On their way home from Spain, they decided to stop by the hotel again, but they couldn't locate it. Trying to get a puddlegram here. You always try. Sometimes it works. It's not too bad. It's not one of the best, but it's not bad. So on the way home again, they try and find the hotel, but they can't find it. Now, stranger still, when they develop their holiday photographs when they come home, this is obviously old, 35mm roll film, not digital, of course. The images taken at the hotel are missing, and they don't appear on the negatives. Remember the old black and white things that they used to create the prints? Even though they were right in the middle of a roll, and you had photos either side had come up perfectly. So did these people actually travel back in time, or just encounter a haunting? Is there a yet undiscovered scientific reason for this reported phenomenon? Or could these people be caught up in some form of paranormal occurrence where, like an old film, it replays the events from years gone by? So the film has been used as a time slip as a plot function many times. I remember as a kid, A Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court, a film I love with Danny Kaye, wasn't it? More recently, I suppose more famously, probably, Back to the Future used this kind of premise of being able to move backwards in time. But can it be genuine? Is it just a Hollywood storytelling mechanism? So Mackenzie's research into the Kersey incident led him to believe so, and he featured it in the lead case in a book he published in Retrocognition in 1997, and it was called Adventures in Time. So several factors led him to conclude that the cadet's experience had been genuine. The obvious sincerity of Lang and his friend Crowley. Ray Baker III was also traced, but turned out to remember nothing of the experience, which is kind of interesting, right? But also the detail of their recollections and a few persuasive discoveries. So amongst the details that impressed Mackenzie the most was the realisation that the house that Lang had identified as a butcher shop, which was a private residence in 1957, and remained one when Kersey was revisited in 1990, dated to about 1350, and had actually been a butcher's shop until as recently as 1790. So there's no way they could have known it was a private house. So the author was also struck by the suggestive fact that the season seemed to change as the cadets entered the village. Inside Kersey, Lang recalled, it was verdant, and the trees were a magnificent green colour one finds in spring or early summer, but of course had come in October. Then there was the puzzle of the village church. Lang noted that the party had not seen it after they descended the village, and a pall of silence fell. Indeed, he explicitly recalled there was no sign of a church. I would certainly have seen it as it had a field of observation of 360 degrees. And Crowley likewise recalled no church or pub. All of which seems really hard to explain, since St Mary's Kersey dates back the church resort to the 14th century and is the principal landmark in the district, and it's readily visible right across the village to anybody passing the main street. So Mackenzie, basing his case on the history of St Mary's, interpreted this anomaly as evidence to help pinpoint the likely date on which Lang and his companions visited the village. Noting that construction of the tower, so the tower we saw, was halted by the ravages of the Black Death. So it started being built, the Black Death came, half the population of the village died, so building work stopped. So Mackenzie concluded that the cadets might have seen it as it had been an aftermath of the plague, when the shell of the half-constructed church would have been hidden by trees. And since Lang and Crowley also recalled the village buildings had glazed windows, a rarity in the Middle Ages, Mackenzie further suggested that the most likely date was circa 1420, when the church remained unfinished, but the village was growing rich from the wool trade. Outside the village pub here, a lovely pub, the Bell. So what a great story. But look through the eyes of a historian, is there some other explanation for the events of 1957? Well, the first thing to say about Kersey is it's exactly the sort of place that might have confused a group of strangers entering it for the first time. The village is certainly ancient. It was first mentioned in the Anglo-Saxon will circa 900, and it still boasts, as we've seen, a large number of buildings dated from the medieval period. So many it's become a favourite location of filmmakers, and is noted by no less an authority than Nicholas Pevsner as the most picturesque village in South Suffolk. Amongst the attractions you'll see the 14th century Bell Inn, and several thatched half-timbered buildings. And Pevsner says it's not hard to imagine these striking remnants might linger in the memory longer than the more humdrum architecture alongside them, producing over time the notion that a witness has visited a place considerably older than expected. So as it turns out, there's also a good explanation for the cadets failing to notice wires or aerials in Kersey. The village was not hooked up to the mains until the early 1950s, and then only after protests from the Suffolk Preservation Society, which argued strenuously for the preservation of its skyline. The revealing outcome of these protests may be found in the British parliamentary papers of the period, which reported that negotiations have resulted in an overhead line being carried behind the houses on either side of the street, and a cable being laid underground at the only point where the street has to be crossed. What are the other details? Questions arise from Mackenzie's account, for example, of the mention of the windows, since glass was expensive and thus rare in the 14th and 15th centuries. So whilst it's possible that Kersey's wealth did make an exception in this period, one wonders why, if it was wealthy, its house would have been devoid of furniture. There's other problems with the dating too, not least the discrepancy between the boy's description of a settlement abandoned, as it might have been in 1349, and Mackenzie's wealthy village of 1420. There's also a question whether a medieval village would have a butcher's shop. Such places did exist, but they were mostly found exclusively in towns. Meat was expensive, which meant most peasants' diets remained largely vegetarian. When animals were slaughtered in a village, for a Saints' Day feast perhaps, they were very hard to keep fresh and would have been consumed immediately. So yeah, meat consumption did rise steadily in the late 14th century, from a tenth or less of the food budget to a quarter or a third afterwards. But the evidence we have suggests that beef was only rarely eaten. In the village of Sedgeford, nearby in Norfolk, only 3 cattle were slaughtered a year around this time. So Sedgeford was only about half the size of Kersey, admittedly, but even so it stretches credulity to imagine a shop with 2 or 3 whole ox carcasses in stock as early as 1420, especially when it's remembered Kersey had its own weekly market, where fresh meat would have been available, which would provide a fierce competition. What this suggests is the cadet's experience is better explained in some other way. Some key elements of the incident, the silence, the lack of life, are highly suggestive of derealisation, a psychological condition which makes the real world seem unreal, as was Versailles' case. Indeed, Mackenzie notes that when I quoted to Mr. Lang Miss Mobley's description of the trees in the park at Versailles being flat and lifeless, like a woodwork in tapestry, he replied that's spot on. And the lack of agreement between witnesses, remember Roy Baker recalled nothing unusual, is also striking. Of course, none of this solves the mystery of why 2 cadets, Lang and Crowley, were in such close agreement, but it is worth pointing out there is a reason why time-slip cases usually have multiple witnesses. The passage of time and a process of mutual reinforcement, as the case is reviewed again and again, accentuate the odd and smooth out the differences. Just as the study of reports of the Indian rope trick published in Nature demonstrated that the strangest accounts were those that had been said to have been witnessed longest ago. So no, I'd love to believe it. I really, 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 I would. But without better evidence, I think we can't concede at this stage that the youths really did travel back in time. But I hope you agree that that is a good story. And times which we mentioned already, but given the beauty of this village, it is a great favourite of TV and film producers. So across the decades, it's been used wide variety. So Lovejoy was mentioned earlier. But the most recent is a very interesting kind of time slip, where time slip is at the heart of the story, and it's called The Magpie Murders. And I don't know who, if anybody, has seen it. I've actually got a trailer that I'm going to show you, and I may get in trouble with YouTube for doing this, because I'm going to show you a YouTube video in a YouTube video, which is kind of going beyond the fourth wall. Never done that before. So if the screen goes black, then you'll understand why. But I'll just stick it on my YouTube channel. I'll stick it on my Facebook channel. But basically, the premise of Magpie Murders is you've got a modern day setting and an historic setting, and both of them feature in the village. So the production people had to both create a modern version of Kersey as it is now, but also a 1950s version of Kersey. So they filmed inside the houses, but they created interiors, both like modern versions and historic versions. So there's a degree of like time slip, kind of crazy. What's what I'm going to look for in this? Like schizophrenia. But they did it incredibly well, and it's a great story. And I'm going to put on the trailer. It's about 2 minutes, just as we kind of wrap up the tour. I think you'll agree. I hope you'll agree. It's worth watching. And basically, the trailer gives you a sense of kind of what is going on. So I'm going to stick my headphones on so I can just find that for you. And hopefully, when it comes up, because the film is about to end, you see Mrs. John there at the end of our walk in the Suffolk countryside. So now I'm going to show you how this village was presented for a modern audience.
I had dinner with Alan last night.
Down the hatch.
Cheers to you. He's finished it.
Magpie Murders.
1 for sorrow, 2 for joy.
Very Agatha Christie.
Number 1 in time for Christmas.
Bloody manuscript. There's no last chapter. A whodunit without the solution. It's not even worth the paper it won't be printed on.
I've got something terrible to tell you. Alan's dead.
I'm going to work out who killed him. I'm going to go to Suffolk and look for the missing pages. Magpie Murders. It's 1955.
There were many who considered Atticus Pund to be the world's greatest detective.
It's not strange how evil can find its roots so easily in an English village. A place of beauty and tranquility. Never underestimate the stupidity of criminals.
There's no such thing as a coincidence. Everything in life is part of a pattern.
What's he doing? What he does.
Alan put you in his books.
Yes, I'm James Fraser, the thick assistant.
Well, then do tell me. I want to know.
He based a character on you. The dim detective.
You stay out of my way. Unmarried, unloved.
Yes, I'm on my own, but that didn't give him the right to turn me into some sort of grotesque loser.
Why does anyone kill anyone? I can think of 4 reasons. Fear, envy, anger, and desire.
He played games designed to hurt people.
Am I the killer?
If someone really did push him off that tower, there'd have been plenty of volunteers.
Why do people buy my books, Susan?
Because they want to know who did it.
Think, recall, analyze. It'll come to you.
It's his last novel, and everyone he knew was in it, and that's why the chapter was taken, because it reveals the secret. The answer's in the book.
You wish to know the answer?
That's all I want to know.
Hopefully that worked okay. I've never done a video within a video before. I may get told off by YouTube for that. I don't know. I'll find out. But I thought it was fun just to drop a YouTube into a YouTube. So I do hope you enjoyed the footage that I shot for you over at Kersey, and like the stories. So of course we started off with the strange story of the 2 girls, the doomed love story between the nurse and the Irish soldier. We started off with a haunting. We've got miracles, of course, happening in the church, including, of course, the airman that was saved from certain death, quite possibly by Mary, and then we talked about, of course, time slip and the strange events of those 3 naval cadets in 1957. So it seemed to me that these places that exist kind of out of time sort of suited that kind of narrative, rather than just sort of say this building, which is great. It's got its place, but sometimes I feel like doing something different. And so yeah, if you haven't already seen it, Magpie Murders is great. It's really different. It's interesting. It's quirky. It's twisty. And if you like, you can have Agatha Christie, Poirot's, and all that sort of. It's like a Miss Marple village with a Poirot type kind of lead in it, Atticus Punt. So it's all over the place. I enjoyed a lot of fun. So thank you everybody for joining me. I'm going to leave it at that. We are going to be talking soon about the calendar. Obviously, we know things have run down. There's problems with the website. We're basically changing the website, and then we reinvigorate the newsletter and so forth. But a lot of guides are busy right now. People working over summer, so it's going to be a quieter period. But don't worry, stick with us, and we'll see you out on the other side. So see you guys on the ice. Bye bye.